And so looking at justice and reentry, looking at individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people who are in recovery for addiction. So this really, and veterans is another popular population that we've seen come through. And so really partnering and looking at the different populations that you're wanting to serve that helps with referrals, and then partnering with those community partners who support those services. So DBHDD, Department of Community Supervision, your local nonprofits, such as the Salvation Army, different veterans programs, the DV shelters that are in the area. So really trying to, again, create that leverage piece, not only for referrals, but they may also have different ways of access to funding in order to do the shelter. Maybe different agencies can contribute to one particular location if it's in a small part of Georgia. And so we are totally encouraging collaboration and coalitions to support one particular building, because we know that in different parts of Georgia, the population may not be big enough to support, 10 units for homeless individuals. But if different agencies are all coming together for one location, that allows for a lot of additional supportive services, as well as potential funding support as well, and staffing for that particular location. So think about partnering. So the application, let's talk about the big stuff here, which I know y'all are here for. So for the non-congregate shelter, it is opening on June 15th. We talked about the end of May, but we wanted to give ourselves another 2 weeks just because we decided to take a different approach toward the application, which we're really excited about. It's going to be 3 months that we're going to be going through. Basically, it's going to be training on the application. So traditionally, what tends to happen, as I know most of you, if not all of you, are aware of, is oftentimes there is an application that's released, and then it's received several months later, and there's not a whole lot of direction for each part of that particular application. And if you're new to applying to this type of funding, it can be a little overwhelming. And so what we really wanted to do is really encourage all different agencies to be able to apply to this program, and not necessarily always depend on a particular grant writer or administrator, just because a lot of agencies don't necessarily have the money for something like that. And so we wanted to be able to partner the application with training, also known as technical assistance, but the definition of that is varied, and so we're just calling it training. So what we're going to be doing is we have a calendar where we're going to be discussing each part of the application at each time. We're also going to be encouraging everyone who's a part of the process to really do a lot of capacity building pieces in your agencies and with all the different groups a part of the development, to make sure that that you're focusing on, really wanting to get the non-congregate shelter to have all the pieces that it needs, including the internal, supportive services once it's built, and making sure that, you have all the referrals that you need. And this is a program that can outlast the compliance period of 10 or 15 years, that this could be a shelter that's around for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And so, so therefore, questions can be asked about the application during the trainings. We're going to have a quiet period for the non-congregate shelter. So for those of you who are still interested in tax credit or the low-income housing tax credit funding, you can still have the meetings with us. You can go on the booking site through our website and still make those appointments, but it would have to be tax credit based. It cannot be non-congregate shelter based. And so, okay, we talked about that point. So there's going to be 2 different submission dates. The first one, I'm going to show you guys the calendar in just a second. The first one is going to be at the end of middle of August, excuse me. So then that way we can go ahead and start doing the environmental reviews. DCA is going to take the cost of the environmental reviews. And so we want to make sure that you guys have the amount of time to do the procurement process if you're wanting to go ahead and reach out and get grant administrators and grant writers. We want to make sure that we can also see if you're environmentally sound and your land and the acquisition and everything, or if you're doing an acquisition and where you're going to be building is okay to be built upon. And so that's why we're doing the 2 different submission dates. Also, for those of you who may not feel like you can, you may not be ready, let me just put it that way, to receive funding at the end of our, of the application. If you want to go through this as a process to help build your capacity, and we want at the end of this for you to be able to take all the data and apply it to other grants. Okay, this is going to be a way for you to gather everything together, to talk with individuals who review grants and help. We're writing this. We're writing this based on a lot of other different grants too. So that way you can take this and use it as a place to house all your information in one place and then reuse it again. We want this to be a very supportive system, not only for this time, but in the future. So that's why we're also doing the 2 different submission dates and all the trainings and things like that. So then that way you can actually have your own little storehouse of data and information for this program for you, and you can build upon it for the future. And then also, like I was saying, it allows for the procurement procedures for grant writers, administrators, and then eventually construction. So therefore with oh, thanks, Evans. Evans, excuse me. We're so excited about this. We're so excited. And again, our heart has been around capacity building. We really want to build capacity, especially in those parts of Georgia that don't have the opportunity to do it. And so we're really excited about doing these little trainings along the way, and then also being able to create that storehouse. So please note, okay, because this is home funding, because this is HUD funding, we really want to make sure that you guys don't do something that makes you unable to receive the funding. So the first is for land, okay? Please do not make any purchases or any kind of construction on it until environmentals are completed, until we're got all the approvals from HUD. And so we will give you the okay to go with regards to land. Also putting ownership under any LLC or LLP to limit exposure to your nonprofit. Do not make any agreements prior to the approval from HUD. Okay, so I would just ultimately say, kind of halt all those particular pieces because we're heading into this home and HUD funding area. Also, the procurement process is a really important piece as well. Our first training is actually going to be about procurement because it is a really interesting process. So you have to go through a 30-day process in order to contract or pay for a grant administrator or a writer. And then as far as with your general contractor and then the construction piece, you also have to go through a procurement process for that too. So the first training we're having is about procurement because it's a really kind of weird thing to figure out, especially if you're not used to this. So before I jump ahead, I know Kelly and Samantha are on. Do you guys have anything else to add with regards to these 2 things? Because I know they're kind of important.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is if you remember nothing else out of this presentation, you remember that we told you, don't go buy land, don't start contracting without going through these processes. Buying land requires a certified letter from HUD, period. Okay? We can't give you money and you can't then pay for anything under this grant land-wise until the proper environmental reviews are done and we get HUD certification. And Charlotte, I'll come back to your question in just a second. The other part is that if you have a grant writer, that you normally use, or a grant administrator that you normally use that is not with a regional commission. Regional commissions are separate, okay? But if you have a grant writer that's not with the regional commission, you have to go through procurement on that grant writer based on your procurement rules. But under 2 CFR 200, which is the statute. So if you have questions about either of those two things, and whether or not you have, especially if we're talking about 2 CFR 200 on procuring a grant writer, we need to make sure that you are using the right rules and process for procurement of a grant writer. And we could do a separate webinar about that if we need to. It wouldn't have to be an hour long, just to give you a little bit more information. Now, if you employ a full-time grant writer or an administrator, then you do not have to procure their own staff, and that's not a contract. Okay, if they're a full-time employee and not a contract employee, this would be specifically for grant writers who are a contract, even if they're a contracted employee. If they are a full-time employee, benefits, the whole bit, then you're good because they're staff. But if they're not, if you're having a contract with them or they're under a contract employment, then yes, that has to be procured. And the amount that they're going to charge would trigger procurement and how much that is and all of that. So like I said, we can talk about that. Let me go back to the question about if the site has already been purchased. We need to start talking about that sooner rather than later, Charlotte. So I would say that if you already have a site that you know that you want to use, and it's a new construction, especially more so than an expansion of a given shelter, like you have a brand new site that you want to use, send us an email at homearp@dca.ga.gov, and let's set up a time to specifically talk about that. We are not the people who are going to be doing the environmental reviews. We have an environmental review team that will be taking a look at that, and I want to make sure that we start that process as soon as we possibly can with them. So shoot me an email, and we'll have our contact information at the end as well.
So because I think that there may be a few, if there are several agencies, and Kelly, we may just want to do maybe a little training or conversation for those agencies who have already purchased, because I know that there's also some that already have some that may have been gifted that, there's a lot of, or not a lot, there's several agencies that have been planning an additional building, whether it be non-congregate shelter or some other type of thing for a while. And so what we may want to do is just have another like mini webinar conversation around it. And so that way we can have, everyone be the teacher in the moment kind of thing. So we'll go ahead and send out some information about that. I have a listserv specifically for this application process. And so we'll go ahead and send it out via that listserv, and the other two probably, just so then that way everyone's informed. So Evan asked about
one more thing. Yeah, and I was gonna talk about Evan as well. Evan, okay. Let us get this webinar scheduled. We'll get Sean Walker to sit in on that with us, and he is the best person to answer your question. If I start trying to answer that question, I'm likely to say something that's incorrect, and I don't want to do that. So we will get something set up sooner rather than later, so that we can go ahead and start having these conversations about that process and how he thinks we should best handle that.